Welcome to our deep dive into the Syrian War. You've probably seen the headlines, but today we're going beyond that.
Yeah.
It's not just about battles and who's winning or losing. We're going to try to unravel this web of alliances and the power struggles and look at why it matters to you, wherever you are in the world.
It's a conflict that, people were hoping for democracy, and it morphed into something much more complex. And the human cost is immense, and the ripple effects are felt globally.
Yeah, okay. So let's rewind back to 2011. The Arab Spring is in full swing.
Right.
What was the atmosphere like in Syria at that time?
Well, you can imagine this wave of optimism washing over the Middle East.
Yeah.
People in Tunisia and Egypt could overthrow dictators.
Right.
Syrians, seeing this, they took to the streets demanding similar changes. They wanted an end to corruption, greater freedoms, and it started with peaceful protests.
Yeah.
Full of hope.
And Bashar al-Assad's regime, how did they react to this call for change?
Well, instead of dialogue, they chose force. I think brutal crackdowns on demonstrators, arrests, and violence escalating rapidly. This wasn't a gentle push for reform. It was a harsh response that ignited the flames of war.
Okay, so we see that the conflict very quickly escalated from peaceful protests to a full-blown war.
Exactly.
But it's not just one group against another, is it?
No.
It's much more complicated than that. Can you break down some of the main players for our listener?
It's like a play with a constantly changing cast of characters. So you have the Assad government clinging to power. They're backed by Russia and Iran.
Right.
Imagine these powerful allies providing both the muscle and the money. And then you have the rebels, who initially seemed unified but splintered over time.
Okay.
Some wanted democracy, others had different agendas, some were more extreme.
Right.
This internal struggle within the rebellion made finding any kind of solutions incredibly difficult.
That's already a lot to keep track of.
Yeah.
And then into this very chaotic mix enters ISIS.
Right.
They weren't part of the initial conflict, so how did they become such a dominant force?
They exploited the chaos. Think of them as opportunists, seizing territory in both Syria and Iraq while everyone else was fighting.
Wow.
Their brutality and their reign of terror quickly made them a major player, even though their goals were really distinct from the original conflict.
It's mind-boggling how many different groups and interests are all entangled in this war.
It is.
And of course, we can't forget about the Kurds.
Right.
Who are they and where do they fit into this?
The Kurds are a large ethnic group who have long sought autonomy in the region. And when the war broke out, they took the opportunity to carve out their own territory in northern Syria.
Okay.
So you have them fighting Assad, fighting ISIS, and vying for their independence amidst the chaos.
It really does sound like everyone is fighting everyone else.
They are.
And then we have to add in the big powers to this already very volatile mix. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Imagine this conflict becoming a stage for global power plays. So the U.S. and some Western nations initially backed certain rebel groups, while Russia firmly stood behind Assad. This essentially turned the Syrian war into a proxy war with global powers using it to advance their own agendas.
Gotcha. Okay. So I think I'm starting to see how this conflict spiraled out of control, but we've talked a lot about all the different groups that are involved.
Right.
Can we shift gears now and discuss the human cost of this war?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's easy to forget that behind the headlines, there are real people whose lives have been just shattered by this conflict.
Yeah, it's easy to just throw around statistics, over 500,000 dead, millions displaced, but those are just numbers. Imagine Aleppo, once a thriving city, now reduced to rubble.
Wow.
Imagine families ripped apart, children who have never known peace. That's the real cost of this war.
Yeah.
A generation scarred, homes destroyed, lives lost. It's a human tragedy of unimaginable scale.
It's really heartbreaking to think about the human cost of this war. And then, to make matters worse, some recent events have thrown the situation into even more turmoil.
They have, yeah. In a shocking turn of events, Assad fled the country, debunking those rumors that his plane had been shot down.
Okay.
And while the details are still emerging, this sudden departure created a huge power vacuum.
And who's stepped into that vacuum?
Well, various militant groups are now in control.
Okay.
But they are far from unified, and they have conflicting goals and ambitions.
Right.
This raises serious concerns about their intentions, the stability of the region, and what this all means for the future of Syria.
So the plot thickens.
It does.
Assad's gone, militants are in control, and the situation is more unpredictable than ever.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait and see what unfolds in this next chapter of the Syrian War. But before we move on to that, can you help connect this conflict to our listeners' life?
Sure.
Why should someone halfway across the world care about what's happening in Syria?
That's a very fair question. We often feel disconnected from events that seem so far away, right?
Right.
But the Syrian war's impact is global. For one, the rise of ISIS, which was fueled by this chaos, shows how extremism can spread beyond borders, directly impacting global security.
So what starts in Syria doesn't necessarily stay in Syria.
Exactly. It can manifest as terrorist attacks in other parts of the world, directly affecting your safety and security.
Oh.
But there are economic impacts, too. Disruptions to oil production in Syria can lead to price hikes that affect your wallet at the gas pump.
So this conflict can hit us where it hurts our sense of security and our finances?
It can.
Yeah.
But beyond just those practical considerations, there's also a human element.
Okay.
By understanding the Syrian war, we foster empathy for those suffering. We become more informed global citizens, better equipped to support efforts for peace, and to understand the complexities of the world around us.
So it's not just about staying informed, it's about becoming more compassionate and engaged global citizens.
Exactly.
And on that note, we'll wrap up part 1 of our deep dive.
Okay.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve into the latest developments and what the future might hold for Syria. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Syrian war. We've laid the groundwork, but the story is far from over. With Assad gone and militant groups now in control, the future of Syria is more uncertain than ever. It's almost like watching a suspenseful movie. You're just on the edge of your seat, wondering what twist is coming next.
Yeah, the stakes are incredibly high, and there are no easy answers. But we can explore some potential scenarios, understanding that the situation is incredibly fluid.
Okay, so lay it on me. What are some possibilities that we might see play out in Syria?
Well, let's start with what I call the fragmented stalemate. Okay, so imagine a map of Syria, divided not along neat lines, but like a shattered mirror.
Okay.
With each piece representing a different militant faction, all vying for control. This scenario sees no single group gaining a decisive upper hand, leading to prolonged instability, low-level conflicts, and continued humanitarian suffering.
So instead of one clear enemy, you've got multiple power struggles happening simultaneously.
Exactly.
That sounds like a recipe for just ongoing chaos.
It is. It would make rebuilding the country and establishing any kind of functioning government nearly impossible.
Right.
Imagine trying to put those shattered mirror pieces back together while everyone is still fighting over them. It's a bleak scenario, but unfortunately a plausible one.
Okay, so that's one possibility. What else could we see happening?
Another potential scenario is the militant takeover. In this case, one of the stronger, more organized militant groups manages to overpower the others, potentially with external support, and establishes control over most of Syria.
So a single group manages to unite those shattered mirror pieces under their rule.
Yes, but the type of rule they establish is a major concern. Some of these groups have ideologies that could lead to a very strict Islamic regime, similar to what we saw with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Think severe restrictions on freedoms, particularly for women and minorities, and a very brutal crackdown on any kind of opposition. It's a chilling possibility.
That sounds like a nightmare scenario for the Syrian people. Would the international community stand by and watch that happen?
It's hard to say for sure. The response would likely depend on the specific group that takes control and their actions, but a takeover by such a hardline group would almost certainly trigger condemnation, sanctions, and potentially even military intervention from some countries, especially if they're seen as a threat to regional or global security. The question is, would intervention make things better or worse?
Right.
It's a very complex dilemma with no easy answers.
So we've got the potential for continued fragmentation or a takeover by a potentially extremist group. Are there any other possibilities that offer a glimmer of hope?
There's always the chance of a negotiated settlement, although it's admittedly the most optimistic and perhaps least likely scenario given the deep distrust and animosity between the different factions. But imagine, if you will, a round table where representatives from each group, as well as key international players, come together to hammer out a power-sharing agreement. It's a long shot, but not entirely impossible.
So you're saying there's a slim chance they could put aside their differences and work towards a more stable and inclusive Syria. What would it take to make that happen?
Well, it would require a massive shift in attitudes, a willingness to compromise from all sides,
Yeah.
and intense pressure from the international community.
Yeah.
But if achieved, it could lead to a more democratic and peaceful future for Syria. It would be a long and arduous process, like rebuilding a city from rubble, but it offers the best hope for lasting stability.
Okay. So we have three potential paths forward, each with its own challenges and risks. But regardless of which scenario unfolds, Syria faces an incredibly difficult road ahead.
Absolutely. The humanitarian crisis alone is staggering. Millions are displaced, homes destroyed, and the country's infrastructure is in ruins. Rebuilding Syria will require an enormous international effort and a sustained commitment that goes far beyond just immediate aid.
And then there's the just monumental task of healing those deep divisions within Syrian society. Years of conflict and brutality have left scars that run very deep.
It's like trying to mend a broken heart. It's not just about rebuilding physical structures. It's about addressing the root causes of the conflict, promoting justice and accountability for the atrocities committed, and fostering a sense of shared identity and purpose among a population that has been torn apart.
That sounds like an incredibly daunting task, especially in a climate of mistrust and resentment.
It won't be easy, but it's crucial. If Syria is to have any hope of a brighter future, it needs to move beyond blame and division towards reconciliation and healing.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a very complex geopolitical landscape, with regional and global powers all vying for influence.
Exactly. The actions and policies of those external actors will continue to play a significant role in shaping Syria's future. Think of it as a giant chess game, with Syria as the board. Every move by countries like Russia, Iran, Turkey, the US, and various European nations will have consequences, both intended and unintended, on the lives of the Syrian people.
It's a sobering reminder that the fate of Syria is not solely in the hands of Syrians. It's a complex web of interconnected forces, both internal and external, that will determine the country's future.
That's why understanding this conflict is so important. It's not just about events happening in a distant land.
Right.
It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of our world, the ripple effects of conflict, and the importance of working towards peaceful solutions, both for the sake of the Syrian people and for global stability.
We've covered a lot of ground in this part, exploring those potential paths forward and the immense challenges Syria faces. But the story doesn't end here. In our final part, we'll shift our focus to the global implications of this conflict and what it means for the world at large. Stay with us. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Syrian War. We've explored the internal dynamics, the power struggles, the humanitarian crisis, and the very uncertain future that lies ahead for Syria.
Right.
But as we've hinted throughout this whole conversation, this conflict, its impact, extends far beyond Syria's borders.
It does.
It's a global issue with ripple effects that touch all of us in ways we might not even realize.
It's like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples spread outward, impacting the entire ecosystem. The Syrian War has created these shockwaves that are felt around the world, from refugee crises to global security concerns.
Let's start with perhaps the most visible and heartbreaking consequence: the massive refugee crisis. Millions of Syrians have been forced to flee their homes, seeking safety and refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. It's really hard to grasp the sheer scale of human displacement caused by this conflict.
Imagine entire cities emptied, families forced to leave everything behind, embarking on dangerous journeys with only the hope of finding some safety.
Wow.
Countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan have really borne the brunt of this crisis.
Yeah.
Hosting vast numbers of refugees, often straining their resources and social fabric.
Right.
It's a testament to their compassion, but it's also an immense burden.
And it's not just a regional issue, is it?
No.
The refugee crisis has really become a global challenge,
It has.
with Syrian refugees seeking asylum in Europe, North America, and other parts of the world. This has sparked political debates, fueled anti-immigrant sentiment, and challenged our traditional notions of asylum and humanitarian assistance.
It's such a complex issue with no easy answers. On one hand, there's this moral obligation to help those fleeing war and persecution.
Right.
On the other hand, countries have legitimate concerns about their capacity to absorb large numbers of refugees and the potential impact on their own societies.
Yeah.
The Syrian refugee crisis has become this touchstone issue, forcing us to confront these very difficult questions about responsibility, burden sharing, and the integration of refugees into new cultures.
It's a stark reminder that we really do live in an interconnected world, What happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. It has global consequences.
It does.
And the refugee crisis is just one piece of this very complex puzzle. We also talk about how the conflict has fueled the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, posing a direct threat to global security.
The Syrian War created this perfect storm for the growth of extremism.
Right.
Imagine a power vacuum, a flood of weapons, and a population completely disillusioned by violence and chaos. That's fertile ground for groups like ISIS to exploit, attracting recruits, establishing training camps, and planning attacks that can reach far beyond Syria's borders.
So this conflict has essentially become a breeding ground for terrorism, impacting the security of countries all over the world.
Yes. And it has led to increased military intervention, with countries like the U.S. and its allies launching airstrikes against ISIS targets in Syria and Iraq.
Right.
But military intervention is a double-edged sword.
Okay.
While it might degrade terrorist groups in the short term, it can also contribute to further instability, civilian casualties, and unintended consequences that only further fuel that cycle of violence.
A very complex situation, with no easy solutions. And to make matters even more complicated, the Syrian war has also fueled geopolitical tensions, particularly between major powers like the U.S. and Russia.
Imagine this chessboard, where each move has these global implications.
No.
Russia's unwavering support for the Assad regime put it at odds with the U.S. and its allies, who backed certain rebel groups. This created a proxy conflict, with each side trying to influence the outcome of the war to advance their own interests.
So the Syrian war has basically become a stage for this global power struggle.
It has.
With the potential for those tensions to escalate into something even more dangerous.
Exactly. And it has highlighted the fragility of international norms, the limits of diplomacy, and the potential for regional conflicts to spiral out of control, dragging in these global powers and threatening global stability.
That's a very sobering thought. This conflict in a relatively small country in the Middle East has really exposed the fault lines in our global order, revealing the interconnectedness of our world and the real challenges of finding peaceful solutions to these very complex problems.
It's a stark reminder that we're all in this together. What happens in one part of the world can have profound consequences for everyone.
Right.
Impacting global security, fueling refugee crises, exacerbating geopolitical tensions, and challenging our collective ability to respond to these very multifaceted challenges.
It can feel really overwhelming, almost paralyzing, to think about the scale and the complexity of this conflict and its ripple effects. Where do we even begin to address these challenges?
It starts with understanding. By delving deeper into the Syrian war, we equip ourselves with knowledge.
Right.
We foster empathy for those affected, and we become more informed and engaged global citizens. We can then use this understanding to support humanitarian efforts, advocate for peaceful solutions, and hold our leaders accountable for their actions.
It's about recognizing our interconnectedness, our shared humanity, and our responsibility to work towards a more peaceful and just world. It's about recognizing that even though we may be physically distant from Syria, we're all connected to this conflict in some way.
We are.
And that connection, that shared humanity, is perhaps the most important takeaway from our deep dive.
It's a reminder that even in the face of immense suffering and seemingly insurmountable challenges, there's always hope. Hope for peace, hope for justice, hope for a better future for Syria and for the world. And that hope, coupled with informed action, is what will ultimately guide us towards a brighter tomorrow.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Syrian war. We hope you found it informative, insightful, and perhaps even a bit inspiring. It's a complex and tragic story, but it's also a story of resilience, courage,
it is,
and the enduring human spirit. And as always, thank you for listening to this deep dive into the Syrian war. We hope this has given you a deeper understanding of this conflict and its global implications. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and never lose hope.